Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming to our Data Citizens Distinguished Lecture Series brought to you by the Institute for Data Science and Computing here at the University of Miami. Thanks for coming, everyone. And I am going to turn it over to Dr. Kenneth Goodman to introduce our speaker.
Thank you very much for that, Michael. And thank you for all of you for being here. My name is Ken Goodman. I direct our Institute for Bioethics, and at IDISC, that is, again, the Institute for Data Science and Computing, the program on data ethics and society. As you know or should know, we hope you will come to learn and appreciate Data Citizens, a distinguished lecture series that IDISC is presenting. The idea is to produce a virtual news series that has panels and in-depth talks on really by experts in the field on basically the role of data in science, in the arts, in the humanities, and for that matter, in contemporary life. And so it's a real privilege to be able today introduce you and welcome Dr. Deborah Stone. Professor Dr. Stone is well, actually, she's all of our heroes because her work has been so compelling over the last several decades. She's Professor Emerita at Brandeis University. She's a political scientist whose work has addressed public policy, sociology, philosophy, and law. Her faculty appointments over the years have included M.I.T, Duke, Yale, Aarhus in Denmark, and in addition to Brandeis. Her text, Policy Paradox, The Art of Political Decision-Making, talks about what I don't know if it's a book jacket or not, Michael, but squishy but often unacknowledged values, stories, and psychology that drive policymaking and analysis. She's written about health policy, disability, caregiving, or altruism, or the lack of it in politics. Her new book, Counting and How We Use Numbers to Decide What Matters, along with others, have become, I know the plural of locus classicus is loci classici in the field. And so with that, Deborah, the floor is yours. Thank you so very much for making time with us this afternoon. It's a real treat to have you here.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank you for inviting me. I'm really tickled by the name of your series, Data Citizens. It seems like a perfect name for a political scientist to think about. So I am going to do a screen share because I have a slideshow. Okay, have you got it? Have you got my screen now?
You do.
Great. All right. Let me start with a serial box version of my talk. And don't worry, there's a lot in the box, but I'm gonna pour out the contents into spoonfuls for you. So first, numbers aren't objective. They aren't facts any more than words or stories are facts. They're creatures of the human imagination, just like poems and paintings. Every number is a metaphor and an argument. Second, numbers aren't born innocent and then somehow later corrupted by politicians or hucksters or distorted by ignorant people. Every number comes into being through human decisions about what counts as a what. Those decisions could just as well have gone the other way or another way. So every number arrives in the world already cooked. If you want to know what a number means, you have to delve into who counted, why, and what they hope to learn or prove or accomplish by counting. And you need to know what they didn't count as well as what they did. In short, numbers are very useful, but before you rely on one, find out how it came to be. Okay. Why should you bother thinking about this stuff, or for that matter, staying for the rest of my talk? Because numbers wield tremendous political power that is both simpler and more mysterious than how to lie with statistics. A number is what you get when you line things up and you count them 1, 2, 3. A number is also what people get when they do arithmetic, calculus, or statistics. But all that fancy math, it all starts with the numbers real people get when they count, like the kid in the picture. The verb to count has two meanings. It means to observe things and tally them up to find out how many there are. To count also means to be important, to be taken into consideration, to matter to somebody or for something. These two meanings are found in all languages that I've been able to check, even Mandarin Chinese, according to one of my students. And the two meanings are deeply connected in how we count. All right, are you ready to learn how to count? I want you to pay careful attention to how Dr. Seuss counts fish. Here we go. One fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish, black fish, blue fish, old fish, new fish. This one has a little car. This one has a little star. Say, what a lot of fish there are. Did you notice? Dr. Seuss never got past two. He's so enchanted by all the different kinds of fish, he lost count. He stopped at two and then he just reveled in the fish. Well, let's go on. Maybe we can learn to count to a higher number. We see them come, we see them go. Some are fast and some are slow. Some are high and some are low. Not one of them is like another. Don't ask us why. Go ask your mother. For us data geeks, there's a deeper question here. If they're all different, what makes them all fish? What is fishness anyway? Dr. Seuss ignores the differences to count them all as fish, and yet he celebrates the differences to count them all as fish. That is the paradox of counting. How can we possibly count things if not one of them is like another? If we didn't group things, we'd have to count everything in the world. In order to count things when they're all unique, we have to find some common features and lump them into groups according to one or two features they share. This is what data scientists call criteria for coding. When we teach kids to count, we don't throw all this philosophy at them. We make it easy. We show them things that are exactly the same. Kids don't have to decide which differences matter because there aren't any. Or sometimes we put a bunch of apples in front of a kid and ask him to count. And again, the kid doesn't have to think about what counts as an apple because the adult has told him. Once kids have mastered this much, we make it more complicated. The Sesame Street book includes both versions of counting, the simple stage and the complex stage. The Cookie Monster's 6 glasses of milk are exactly the same. They're the same in size, shape, color. They're even filled to the same level. But the 6 cookies are all different. They're the same shape, but they all have different frosting. They're different, yet the book teaches kids they're all the same. They all count as cookies. You might think, come on, Deborah, you're being picky. But here's why we've got a problem. Imagine you made this batch of cookies. You tell a group of kids they can each take one. Alberto goes first, then Michael, then Ken, then Evelyn, then Sasha, then Jacqueline. Do you think Jacqueline's going to think she was treated fairly when all she got was the plain cookie and Alberto took the one with the pink squiggles? No. Only adults who've lost their sense of what makes cookies specially good could think these cookies count equally. So when we teach kids to count, we're teaching them how adults see things and what adults in their culture consider important. Take a minute to read this cartoon. I showed this cartoon to my cousin. She didn't understand. What's the problem? Of course Obama's black, she said. Look at him. Would you say he's white? I had to think about that. Why the disconnect? My cousin sees one feature of Obama, the color of his skin, and sees a clear answer how to categorize him. Chuck Seiler, the cartoonist, considers another feature of Obama, namely the races of his parents, and he sees a puzzle. If race is a parental inheritance, which parent gives Obama his race? The point of the cartoon is that categorization rules are cultural. They're made up by people and they're enforced by people. There's nothing objective about them. This is what I mean when I say numbers are metaphors and counting is based on metaphorical reasoning. Let's move ahead from kindergarten to middle school, where you learned about poetry. To make a metaphor, you find one or two similarities between things that are different, and then you say they're the same. The moon and a brie cheese are both round and white. So you say, the moon is brie cheese. Of course, you can't eat the moon, but the mental process is the same in counting. You focus on one or two similarities, you ignore differences, and then you say they are or count the same. Numbers and metaphors may be fiction, but they're also powerful arguments. They say a number and a metaphor both assert this is a that. Obama is black, or he is a white man. Categories are ways of seeing and not seeing. When we make categories, we're saying some things are important and other things are merely frosting on the cookie. You've probably seen headlines like this that project when the United States will no longer be a majority white nation. I think the current projection is the year 2042. When the Census Bureau makes these projections, it uses the unspoken counting rule in the Obama cartoon. It counts children of mixed race couples as the same race as their non-white parent. Since rates of intermarriage between whites and non-whites are going up, presto, the proportion of whites is going down. Hispanics are considered white, but the Census Bureau distinguishes between Hispanic whites and non-Hispanic whites. The whites in the headline and in the projections refer to non-Hispanic whites, as though Hispanics can't be real whites. These counting rules can't help but provoke white anxieties. They pit people against each other. Real whites versus Hispanics and everybody else. And in a democracy, who wants to be in a minority? Being in the minority means you lose. I learned this lesson in kindergarten when our teacher had us sit cross-legged on the floor and raise our hands to vote whether we wanted to finger paint or listen to her read a story. I think people who grow up in a democratic culture, as I did, have this idea in their bones that it's not good to be in the minority. You don't get your way. You probably know how the census gets race information on people because you recently filled in this question. The question that asks, what is this person's race? In addition to white, black, American Indian / Alaska Native, there are 11 other possible races to choose from, even though some of them are really nationalities, such as Korean or Japanese. Or you can use the some other race line to fill in your own race. That's at the bottom, the last one on this questionnaire. In 2010, some other race was the third largest race in the United States. And that tells you something about how people don't like squeezing themselves into boxes that somebody else gave them. Race is an idea, not a fact. How does the Census Bureau decide how to classify people? There are 3 levels of decision-making that go into the final number. First, the individual who fills out the form and says what race they are. And since 2000, people can choose more than one. So you can be 6 races, 7 races if you want. Then at the second level, the Census Bureau groups the answers into fewer categories, like white, Black, or Hispanic. And third, there's a missing step that's not so obvious. The Census Bureau decided on which categories and labels to use in the survey we all fill out. So the Census Bureau already constrained and influenced how people can identify themselves. Just for fun, here's a chart showing all the different race and ethnicity categories used in the federal census from the first one in 1790 to the last one in 2010. You can't read it, but suffice it to say that both the general categories and the names or labels for them changed a lot from one decade to the next. The blue boxes are all people we now call Black, but the labels vary from slaves in 1790, the first blue box, to Black, mulatto, quadroon, and octoroon, free Black persons, Negro, colored persons, and African Americans. The pink row, the pink boxes in the bottom row of both halves of this chart represent whites. And curiously, the label for whites never changed, not once from 1790 to now. The green boxes represent the people we now call Hispanic. In 1930 was the first time that Mexicans were counted, and the first box, you can see my cursor here, that one says Mexicans. And then in 1980, the Census Bureau started counting Hispanics. And it's these 3 boxes right here. And the labels were origin or descent, Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Central American, South American, or simply of Spanish origin. And these, of course, represented all the places where migrants were coming to the United States. Let me give one more example. How are we counting COVID deaths? It's similar to the way we count races in that there are several stages of counting. At the initial stage, individual doctors make a decision whether to count a death as due to COVID on the death certificate. They assign a primary cause of death. And this is how we've been booking or recording causes of death all along. There's nothing new with COVID here. And then the death certificates go to city and state agencies who then have their own criteria for what they count as a COVID death. For example, in New York City, at the peak of the epidemic last spring, the New York City Department of Health at first didn't count people who died at home, even if they had all the COVID symptoms, if they didn't have a positive test on their record. Initially, the CDC took the same stance. Both changed their stance, and when they did, the numbers shot up. Well, here's another quirky thing. If you only count people who had a positive test around the time they died, then the number of COVID deaths is limited by how much testing a community does. Even Donald Trump gets that one. If we didn't do so many tests, we wouldn't have so many cases, he kept saying. Epidemiologists have another way to count COVID deaths called excess deaths. They compare total deaths in a community in the same time period or season over several years. Since the total deaths were very high this year, that suggests that maybe there were a lot more COVID deaths than the official numbers. I'll just add that for me, The most compelling measure of COVID deaths are the photos of makeshift morgues and mass burial sites. Even though numbers are thoroughly contingent on cultural and personal ideas, they're extremely useful as long as you know how they came to be, who made them, and what cultural and political assumptions are behind them. Unemployment is an especially important indicator of the nation's economic health. Every month, the Bureau of Labor Statistics publishes unemployment numbers. It gets these numbers from a survey of about 60,000 households. Well, I've taught you how to count, so now I'm going to give you a crash course in how to count unemployment. You're going to train to be a surveyor for the Bureau of Labor Statistics. You go to a house, or you call now, and you ask a person whether they're currently working. If not, you might think they're unemployed, but it's not that simple. First, they have to get themselves into an imaginary thing called the labor force. They don't count as unemployed if they're not in the labor force. Well, here are the rules for how one gets into the labor force. Ask if the person looked for work during the past 4 weeks. If they say yes, ask them, how did you look? It doesn't count if they just schmoozed with their friends, networking, or they perused the help wanted ads. They have to actively look, say by applying for jobs or knocking on doors and asking if the business is hiring. If they pass that test of actively looking, or having actively looked, then you ask them, if you were offered a job, could you start right away? If they say no, no matter what the reason, they're sick, they're injured, they have a complicated pregnancy, they have sick kids or other family caregiving responsibilities, they're not in the labor force, so they can't be counted as unemployed. Next, if they've been out of work for 4 weeks and they have given up looking for a new job, they're not in the labor force either, and they don't count as unemployed. They'll be counted as discouraged workers, but they won't make the nightly news. Look at these two photos, one from the 1930s and the other from now. Many, if not most people standing in these lines probably don't have paychecks, but they don't count as unemployed necessarily. Why would we have counting rules that violate most people's sense of what it means to be unemployed? Because, like all counting rules, they're established by people in power. I'll give you a minute to read this one. This Peanuts cartoon came out on the same day my book was published, which tickles me no end. The unemployment rules were first established by a guy who was the labor commissioner of Massachusetts in 1874. At that time, there was a huge financial panic and massive unemployment. And the commissioner wanted to count the unemployed in order to prove that it wasn't so bad, because there was a lot of political protest. The workers were not happy. So he asked the local tax assessors and cops to go around in their communities and count the number of unemployed. And he gave them some counting rules. He said, don't count women and children. Never mind that in that time period, women and children, almost all of them worked on farms and in factories, and they were an important source of family income. And the commissioner told the cops and the assessors, count only able-bodied men who really want to work. How were cops supposed to determine who really wants to work? Well, it's anybody's guess, but I can guess that a lot of local gossip and prejudice went into it. Talk about discretionary decisions. That guy, Lowell Wright, went on to become the first head of the National Bureau of Labor Statistics in 1894, and he brought his attitudes about work with him. The labor force is a modern formulation of Wright's criterion, able-bodied men who really want to work. If these rules are so wrong or so inaccurate, how come they haven't been changed? I think there are two reasons. First, economists and policymakers who use the data want historical consistency. If we change how we count, we can't make valid comparisons over time. We can't know if things are getting better or worse. I think a more important reason is cultural. In the US, we have strong beliefs about deserving and undeserving poor, and about there being two kinds of people, hardworking and lazy, and about who deserves society's help. If we give benefits to the lazy, they won't have any incentive to work. We're hearing the same argument now about extending the COVID supplementary unemployment benefits. Here's a question for us to ponder, and I hope come back to in the Q&A. If you're a data scientist, you have an ethical choice to make. Which is more important, being able to accurately compare numbers over time, or realistically counting how the economy or COVID or whatever else you're counting affects people so as to be able to lessen the problem? Our ways of counting derive not only from decisions of powerful people, they also rest on power structures built into law. At the Constitutional Convention in the United States, it wasn't the United States yet, but in 1777, slavery was the most contentious issue. And it came to a head in the question of how to count slaves in the federal census, because the number of persons in a state would determine how many representatives the state got in the House and how many delegates to the Electoral College. The South wanted slaves to count as people, even though they couldn't vote. The North wanted slaves to count as property, so the South wouldn't dominate Congress and the presidency. Also, at that time, in the original Constitution, the states had to pay taxes to fund the federal government. And so, and the amount of taxes would be determined by both the population and the property. And if slaves counted as property, that was going to mean higher taxes for the South. The way the founding fathers resolved this problem was something called the Three-Fifths Compromise. It's a clause in the Constitution that says slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person in the federal census. Alexander Hamilton and James Madison and John Jay wrote a series of essays called the Federalist Papers, and they published them in the newspapers to persuade people in the states to vote to ratify the Constitution. And each essay justified or said why a particular provision of this draft Constitution was really good. Madison wrote the one that came to be called number 54 to justify 3/5 as the right fraction for counting slaves. Here's how he argued. He said, in some ways, the law treats slaves as property. They can be bought and sold. They can be compelled to labor for their masters, and they're always subject to being restrained in their liberty and chastised. That's an understatement. In other ways, The law treats slaves as people, he said. They're protected against violence by others, even their master. There were no fact checkers in those days. And he went on, they're held responsible for crimes and can't, just like people, every other person is, and they can be punished for violence against others. Madison then concluded with this sentence on the slide. This is in fact their true character. Note what he did. To find out whether slaves are property or people, Madison examined how the law treated slaves. That law was made by dominant white elites and slaveholders like him. Then he converted these utterly human decisions into supposedly immutable character traits of slaves. Since this is how slaves are, part human and part property, it is correct to count them this way, he says. Moving ahead 250 years, algorithms are now used in the criminal justice system to help judges, prosecutors, and parole boards predict whether a defendant will commit future crimes. Advocates of using algorithms to decide these cases say they're objective and more accurate than humans. They use only documented facts, such as demographic data, prior convictions, and personal information like residence, education level, job history, and family status. Algorithms don't harbor personal biases, their advocates say, unlike people. But here's the rub. The data they use are human decisions. They rely heavily on the number of prior arrests and convictions a defendant has had. To the computer, these data points are only numbers. But think about it. Every arrest is a decision by a cop about suspicious behavior and whether to arrest someone. Every conviction starts with a prosecutor's decision on what crime to charge and ends with a judge's or a jury's decision on whether the person was guilty. Every data point that says the defendant lives in a high poverty neighborhood, a high crime neighborhood, is the result of human decisions about segregation, redlining, bank loans, school funding, and so much more systemic racism. If these are the data an algorithm has to work with, the algorithm will perpetuate the same prejudices that made the data. The algorithm's risk score for a parole applicant is nothing more than shorthand for all this human judgment. And these are not trivial human judgments. Say, is a cookie with pink squiggle frosting better than one with chocolate dots? These are judgments where one set of people throws another set of people in prison and keeps them there. This is a high-tech version of Madison's thinking. Madison examined how the law treated slaves as saleable property without free will. Then he converted these human decisions into inborn character traits. Predictive algorithms examine how the law treats people in criminal arrests and proceedings, and in education and other policies. Then the algorithm converts these human decisions into character traits, only now they have the scientific sounding name of risk score. For my last example, I want to talk about how we decide what to count and whether a measure really measures what we think it does. This is what data scientists call validity. If we want to learn whether peace-building efforts in war-torn countries are working, we need a way to measure peace and security. The standard way US aid agencies and military agencies measure is to look for whether a country has elections to national and local governing bodies, because they assume that democracy makes for peace and security. And they often count the number of domestic police and security forces, again, because they assume that police and security forces provide security and keep the peace. But these measures are built on Western assumptions that democracy leads to peace and that security forces actually create security. Pamina Firchow created the Everyday Peace Indicators Project to find out what makes villagers in war-torn countries feel protected and secure. She and her colleagues went to villages in Afghanistan, Uganda, and Colombia and asked people, what are the signs that tell you whether or not there is peace in your village? The answers were heartbreakingly simple and nothing like what Westerners imagined as indicators of peace. In Afghanistan, people said, we see girls going to school. Why is that an indicator of peace? Because the Taliban forbids girls to go to school. So if girls are going to school, it means the Taliban isn't around to prevent them from going to school. We see antennas on houses. The Taliban forbids radio and TV. So this means they're not around making trouble. We see local Afghan police. This is important because in many places, local police collect their paychecks and do nothing, or they rob, beat, and rape villagers. So if villagers say police give them a sense of security, that means the police are actually showing up and doing their job. Only counting the number of police on a payroll sheet wouldn't be a good measure of peace. There are two lessons here. First, before you count, find out what matters to the people you're counting. And second, involve the people you're counting in designing your measures. These are the tenets of a field known as participatory counting. Jean Piaget, the pioneer of child psychology and child learning, studied how kids come to have a sense of quantity and learn to count accurately. He wanted to find out how early, how young kids could count. In a famous experiment, he lined up 2 rows of clay pellets with 6 pellets in each row. He asked the kids which row had more. Most kids said they were the same. Then he took away 4 pellets from one of the rows, but he stretched it out so that it was longer than the row with 6 pellets. And he asked the kids again. And this time, most of the kids said that the longer row with 4 pellets had more. Years later, 2 M.I.T. psychologists duplicated the experiment with M&Ms. They laid out the M&Ms in rows, and when they stretched out the one row with 4, and they, instead of saying which row has more, they said, take the row you want to eat and eat them. The kids got it right. The researchers concluded, given sufficient motivation, very young kids can judge quantity. From this experiment, I need to supplement my first definition of number. The correct number is what you get when you want to eat what you count. Motivation has a lot to do with how we count. We count what we care about. We count what matters to us. Thank you.
Super. What if I were to prefer the orange ones over the yellow ones?
Well, I couldn't find a picture of Piaget's experiment. This is the closest I could come, and I thought it was a pretty cute picture.
I also must say that among the cookies that you show, I would have chosen the chocolate one, not the pink one. But yeah.
I know, but I didn't want to gender stereotype you, Alberto.
Yeah. It's only because I like chocolate.
So we have time for a number of questions. I know that I do. I'm sure Alberto, Michael do. Do we have someone? Are we able to put questions in chat, Michael?
Yes, everybody, if you'd like to ask some questions, you can put your question in the Q&A button down at the bottom panel instead of the chat. So feel free to place your questions in the Q&A down there.
I actually have a question because I read your book, as you know, and while reading it, I was wondering whether, and this is the open question for you, when you say that counting is not objective, are we referring to the fact of counting objects after they have been defined? Or is the problem the way that we define and demarcate phenomena so we can count in which case the subjective part of it will be the demarcation, right? Although you may refer as all those processes together as counting, the demarcation, the definition, and then the counting itself, and you're using the term counting to encompass all of that together. So I always had that sort of like that doubt in my mind.
Yeah, so the question is whether I think we have to define objects, and different cultures define objects in different ways, right? So I'm referring to counting as I think it incorporates defining what counts as one of these objects. Someone asked me in an interview when I said, in order to count, we have to define what counts first. What objects are we counting? And he said, not necessarily. I have 2 children. There's no question about it. There's no, defining which one is my child or how many children I have. And at first I was kind of stumped and I thought, oh, maybe there are some cut and dried things but then I remembered something I learned in Nepal, which is that in Nepal and many countries where there's a very high infant mortality rate, they don't give their children a name until they're 6 months old. And they don't count them. They don't numerically count their kids anyway, but they don't count them as a member of the family until they've proved their longevity. And it's kind of a sad, a sad example of don't count your chickens before they hatch. So even something like children, and then I thought, well, we have similar things in our culture where it's not clear how we define children. So one big issue is, when does a fetus become viable and become a person? That's the definitional question at the heart of a major political issue right now, and a lot of laws. So I pretty much think everything has to be defined and is defined by culture. And I think that we do the same thing with language. When we give names to things, those are nouns, and we group things together that are different, that like Dr. Seuss's fish, and we might call them all fish by giving them the same name. We're naming them the same, we're counting them the same. And I think counting and naming are really the same mental operation. But I'm not a linguist, and that's something I'd love to know if other people have thoughts on.
So there are a number of questions here, and let me share them. But I want to pick up this thread again, because I think that what you've done is you've stimulated a discussion about the nature of objectivity and the possibility of knowledge about certain things. And I reckon there are people who build spaceships who say, we've done a pretty good job, for our purposes at least, counting what needs to be counted in order to make sure it functions as intended. Let me ask you, has our awareness, the first question, has our awareness of the way counting is being skewed grown in recent years? or has more familiarity with statistics eroded trust?
I think as a social scientist, I wouldn't venture to answer that question. I can't say anything about awareness, but you know, I don't have any measures of it in the past. But I certainly think that with the rise of alt facts and especially in the Trump administration, but also you know, earlier, but especially in the last 4 years, I think our sensitivity to objectivity and subjectivity has really, really increased to the point that we're all feeling a lot of pain, or many of us are.
Here we are indeed. In a hospital, you know, they will actually give you a little emojis, so you can point to the ones that are happy face, ranging across 10 to a sad face, to try and give a measure of your pain. So how much does it hurt is actually thought by some to be a countable thing, which is related to the next question. It's a very interesting question. It makes a distinction between what we call mass terms and count nouns, if you will. The question is, so some things can, or at least we think, be counted. What about estimates of things that you actually can't count, like the world population, which sometimes you have a number for without anyone having done any particularly fine-grained counting? So is that a distinction that you find interesting?
I'm not sure. If you said mass things,
well, right. So the names of different things. So, for example, water is different than rocks, because I can count rocks, or think I can, but I can't count waters. You know, or I have to be lakes. So mass terms, the terms.
Yeah. Okay.
Things that are, and it's also related, I'm reading the question right now, things that are related not to objects that can be physically counted, but that need to be estimated somehow. For example, population also. So if you see a difference between counting physical objects and
population, I mean, you could theoretically physically count population. They're divisible into, you know, people. But I think I haven't. The problem with counting, say, water or clouds is that we don't have boundaries around them. We have to make boundaries. You can put water in a container, but what do you do with clouds? How do you do? I don't know. So that's one. I haven't thought a whole lot about physical things. I have thought a lot about social concepts that are absolutely not divisible into units, into discrete units in any way. And pain, which Ken just raised, is a great example of that. It's a perception, it's an experience. It's not even observable. There were a lot of efforts in the 1990s to try to measure pain objectively. These efforts were stimulated by the Social Security Administration, which was very upset that it was having to pay a lot of benefits to people on disability, whose main disability was pain. And they, all social welfare agencies want objective ways of testing people's needs. So the pain scale, the one when you go to a doctor and they ask how bad is it on a scale from 1 to 10, where 1 is almost nothing and 10 is I want to jump out the window. And sometimes they put these emojis on to give people an idea. I've personally never found those very helpful or relatable, you know, to my pain. And what I talk to a lot of people about the pain scales, both patients and practitioners or clinicians, and patients generally really have a hard time answering those questions. How do I know whether it's a 4 or a 5 or a 4 or a 7? And it changes, and so they find that question really frustrating. Clinicians find it really useful. It gives them some benchmarks, and if people have a different number when they come back a second time, they think maybe the treatment is working or not working. And so it becomes, even though this is the vaguest and most subjective of measurement instruments, it becomes a language of communication between two sets of people who otherwise would have a hard time talking about this stuff.
So you raised the point about social issues, and that's a nice transition to a question here about our institutions. How could we get universities to move away from the old 5 races plus Hispanic classification system that's still dominating the class? It still dominates the classification of students, instead of a more flexible one offered by the 2020 census. Is that an issue that you care about, or are they all illicit in some sort of way?
They could use these questions. They could ask people to self-identify, but I think the pressure to keep using the old classification system comes from the Office of Management and Budget and from all the agencies that are trying to enforce civil rights laws and trying to examine disparities in access to this, that, and the other, or how universities are treating their student bodies fairly. And again, it comes back to that question I asked earlier. If we don't have standard ways of comparing across universities and across time, how can we know if we're making progress, or if a university is doing particularly badly on these things? The other problem, I think, racial classification, racial and ethnic classification, is so problematic because it is, as I said, a human idea that people somehow are divisible into these groups that are different. And we have an idea that it's somehow biological. It comes from parental inheritance. And then like Ancestry.com will tell you what percentage Pole you are, and, Korean or whatever. But when you think about it, everybody is the product of so much intermixing. How the heck do you count race of people who have 2% this, 3% this, 4% this, 7% that, 23% the other? To me, the concept just doesn't make sense. And to a lot of social scientists and philosophers, the concept of race doesn't make sense.
Would you agree? Would you agree that the efforts, though, to try and wrench some sort of meaning out of this socially manufactured concept is not malign? In other words, while we may all agree with you, the people who own slaves would be indifferent to that. They say, I know the criteria I want for the people in my country that I want to be able to buy and sell. And if we're trying to manage that legacy and redress those wrongs, then someone could argue, you're right, these are pretty slippery concepts, but if we don't ask and we don't try and get our hands around some of them, we will miss opportunities to correct examples of previous discrimination.
Absolutely, I totally agree with you there. There's a debate in this country about whether, the way Justice Roberts once put it, the way to stop discriminating is stop discrimination is to stop discriminating. And what that implies is stop counting race or identifying people but as different races and ethnicities. And I think in order to undo discrimination, you have to take account of color, race, ethnicity, whatever you want to call it. So yes, I totally agree. We have to count it. I'm just not sure how to do it better. And I think it will always be contentious because of this problem that people reproduce and with other people of different backgrounds, and we're all mixed up. So yeah, okay.
I'll go for not interrupted. I just
was just saying, there's some, so a lot of people are saying and doing well, let's add in some economic criteria because class is really just as much a basis of discrimination and disadvantage as race and ethnicity. And the two are, they're really intertwined, but maybe taking some of those race and class, class and economic status into account could help focus more on, in combination with race and ethnicity, could help us focus more on disadvantage, identified disadvantage, and remedy it.
You drew a distinction that I think is, and it's in one of our questions, one of the participants has followed up on it. The great philosopher Dr. Seuss, of course, had a pretty rudimentary number system, but you linked the association, the relationship between naming and counting is quite interesting. The question is, as long as naming and grouping are similar processes, could we say that different language systems involve different counting systems? There are, as perhaps you know, I remember learning once, there's some cultures where they have two, it's not one and two, it's one and more than one. And how much of that do you think has a consequence that we can look at in terms of society, or in terms of communication, or in terms of human well-being?
I've read a little bit about these societies that have different counting systems, and some, I don't know too much about it, but definitely counting and language are both cultural, and there are real differences. I think there's some tribes in South America that don't count past 7, and after that they say a lot, sort of like Dr. Seuss, say what a lot. And then I think there are some cultures where it's not permissible to count certain things, like your children. I forget where I read that, or what the culture that is, but and think about that. Maybe some people in the audience have some ideas about things that it's taboo to count in the American culture or your specific culture. It would be interesting to know.
I recall hearing in some cultures where women or females are disadvantaged in various ways. If you were to have 5 children, of which 3 are males, and someone asks you how many children do you have, you'd say 3. Then you wouldn't even count your girls in reporting to answer that question.
Yeah.
Deborah, one question follows up on an earlier point you made. How would you address the validity of statistics to measure global problems or the state of things, indicators such as human development or state of democracy in different countries? Is there a similar answer to that? We have to surrender a little bit in terms of redressing racism, because we need to know quantities and comparative quantities. But what does that mean in terms of measuring the state of anything, well-being, food availability, income levels, and that sort of thing?
Well, let me say, I think, as I said about race and ethnicity, I think we have to try, even though I think we're never going to get some perfectly valid measure. I looked at a really wonderful effort by my political science colleagues to measure democracy and compare the strength of democracy in different countries around the world. And they do this by, it's a project called VDEM, and it's kind of based in Norway, but it uses political scientists from all over the world. And they ask experts on different countries to rate countries on a bunch of different questions, using a scale from 0 to 4, I think it is. And they have questions like, how strong are civil liberties for women in this country, where 4 is very strong and 0 is not at all, or something. And then they take all these hundreds of answers and to thousands of questions, and they crank them through some fancy statistics that are way beyond me. And they come up with a measure on a 1,000-point scale for each country of how strong that democracy is. I looked at the questionnaires, the most recent ones, as I was writing my book, and the questions are quite fuzzy and ambiguous. And I went through some of the questions with someone I know who is a country expert and answers these questions. And she told me that, well, I just make an impressionistic guess for this question. And we went through several questions like this. So these impressionistic guesses, and I would say that's subjective, it's based on a deep knowledge, but you can't capture democracy or even civil liberties as very precisely in a question, that people have questionnaire people have take a couple hours to answer. So you come up with this really false precision of, Norway is 989 or something, and North Korea is down there at 0.27. And I think those, we all agree that probably those, I don't know if we all agree, but I think it's hard. And I think the point of trying is that you learn a lot. When you ask questions and then you raise questions about the questions and the validity of the questions, you learn to sharpen your thinking and maybe make the questions better next time around. So that's the reason. I think we can't do it perfectly or even close to perfectly, but it's definitely worth trying.
It's in some sense it captures some of the thrust of your remarks, the illusion of precision. Because people, I'm looking at 7 M&Ms, and we can debate about 7 M&Ms, but if we want to talk about quantum states or democracy or that sort of thing, as soon as we assign a number to it, people think it's like M&Ms when it might not be.
Yeah.
I'm not going to edit these too much. The difference between mathematics and counting. In other words, mathematics is in some sense is related, obviously, to counting. There are a lot of branches of mathematics that are not about counting at all, or at least they may be about quantity, but not counting. I pass it on. Difference between mathematics and counting. Want to say anything about that, or should I move on?
Okay, I saw a note that said Eve wants to answer that question live.
Okay. Go for it.
No? Is that? Eve, did you want to answer that? Okay. I kind of use math, arithmetic, statistics, and numbers synonymously or interchangeably, but they're not. And at the beginning, I said, I think math, when we use the word math or arithmetic or even statistics, we talk about doing something with the numbers that people like to call raw numbers, especially data scientists, like to call raw numbers. Though raw numbers are the ones that you get when you count, like the kid counting the M&Ms, let's say, and then you add up 2 and 2, and that's arithmetic, and you put them in an algebra formula, and I guess that's mathematics. I think our names have a difference, but the point that I really want you all to get is that no matter what level of mathematics you're doing, except for what's called pure math, which is also not my bailiwick, no matter what level, it starts with numbers that come from counting. That simple process of assessing or tallying up how many of something there is or how frequently something happens. Does that answer the question?
I think so, yeah. Let me our colleague Tim Norris, who gave a beautiful talk last week, says, you mentioned participatory counting as an alternative to top-down counting schemes. while it is likely this will return interesting and different results, what caveats might you make or exist for such an alternative?
Well, first of all, as I'm a fan of democracy and inclusiveness, so I think that's a good thing. What are the caveats? I think the different results that would happen, I illustrated with the peace indicators. And by the way, the people in this project, they came up with ways of building those statements into questionnaires that they then they use scales, like, you know, how often do you see girls going to school on a 1 to 5 scale, and then they could manipulate those numbers to compare across communities or across time. But what caveats might there be for participatory counting? Well, one would be that, say, as in any small group, some people will kind of tend to dominate. So it might be, if you did this in this exercise in a co-ed group village meeting in Afghanistan, women might be afraid to speak out and say what they care about. So when you're doing participatory research, then you really need to think about what's the power structure in that group or community where you're researching, and how can you separate out the weak people from the powerful people and get the weak people, give them a chance to speak unobstructed and unhindered. I think that's probably the main caveat. I'm sure there are more, but why don't we go on, unless...
Oscar says, somebody who worked in public health often encountered some of the survey questions about levels of pain and that sort of thing, and compares them to onset of symptoms or conditions. For example, infantile, gestational, juvenile, or adult onset diabetes. And so it's about quantifying or estimating things having to do with some cultural and linguistic differences. In other words, once you get people thinking about cultural differences or linguistic differences, it becomes really quite fertile. People realize how much of this might not be as precise or as we might have hoped.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm reading the question. I wouldn't know.
Not just a question. It's just it's basically it's an affirmation that once you start looking, you see lots of examples of scales that can be used. Pain, we talked about pain. Diabetes is another. There are different grades of things. We talk about different in health and in public health and in the health professions. Well, different symptoms are more or less severe. I mean, there's a counting system that's the basis of a lot of the stuff that Alberto's been working on, right? And it's the difference between 0 and 1. I mean, either something is there or it's not, unless it's Schrodinger's cat, I suppose. Are you counting? Something's on or off, 0 or 1.
Yeah, let me say a little bit more about pain. One of the first medical sociology articles I ever read, and it sticks in my mind, was a comparison of how 4 ethnic groups in Boston answer questions about pain. And it was Italians, Jews, Irish, and I forget, probably Protestants, white, WASP, I'm not sure. But it was done in the 1950s. And what they found was that, I don't remember which was which, except that Jews tended to be more catastrophic in their thinking. And if they had a little pain, they would worry that it was indicative of something much more serious going on. And another ethnic group more sort of brushed it off or whatever. So that's one thought about that. The other thought about that, and I'm sure it's Oscar Carta or Cerda, I'm not sure, knows this, But there's a Canadian fellow, he just died recently, Ronald Melzack, who developed an alternative way to measure pain with words. And he went to a pain ward when he was in graduate school, and he listened to how people described their pain. And he wrote down tons and tons of words. I think there's like 100 different words. And then he grouped them into categories like burning, or trying to remember what the categories are: sharp, cool, dull. And he found out that people could express their experience much better with words. They had a very rich vocabulary, and the 1 to 10 scale just absolutely flattened all that richness. Another thing he learned is that some doctors told him that some words are absolutely diagnostic. If a patient describes a certain kind of stomach pain, a certain kind of pain, abdominal pain, I can't remember what it is a diagnostic criterion for a certain stomach ailment. So it's an interesting question to think about, how informative are numbers and words, and what different kinds of information do we get from numbers and words?
Thank you for that. Erwin, by the way, makes two remarks. One of them we have to quote about some things that are taboo. He says in some places of the country, it's taboo to count votes. Or count them accurately. But he also asks, how durable are counting of feelings or emotional perceptions about something over time? How do we understand that better? For example, one might feel good, say 4 out of 5 on a 1 to 5 scale, about a particular topic that does not have a changeable short-term metric. I feel good about our healthcare system as it pertains to me, people I know, and by extension other Americans, because I have health insurance and a job, as opposed to I feel good about the Philadelphia Eagles, which is probably a mistake, but when they're winning versus losing week over week. In other words, some things are inherently vague, I guess, and they're going to be harder to count than things that we had thought were not so vague and precise. What you're doing is you're trying to, if I'm right, and trying to help come up with an answer to Erwin's question. We are overconfident about what those things that we count as precise. They're more like other sorts of things, like that are our opinions about something, or the Philadelphia Eagles, right?
Yeah. Well, one thing that I kind of thought of when you read the first part of this question is the work of Kahneman and Tversky on cognitive biases. And they did some experiments with people about how they feel about disability, and how they would feel about losing their sight, or some other disability. And people generally, if they did not have that particular problem, they thought it would be terrible. And then they asked people who had a problem like that, how they felt about it. And I think they had some people that they could actually compare over time, and the same people. And people seem to feel much less badly about a disability once they have it. And they explored, is this because we adapt to it? Is this because nobody wants to go around feeling miserable all the time? And so we talk ourselves into it's not so bad. So I love that word durable in the question. I think people's feelings and emotional states are not very durable. And even something about, I mean, I find myself feeling so angry about politics, and for a while after Biden's victory was certified, I felt terrific and relieved, and I way much lower down on the anger scale, and pretty quickly I got up there again. It's a great question. Yeah.
It occurs to me that we haven't talked about the counting issue of our time. I would have thought that, it might be that I sent in 2 ballots and I shouldn't have, but why is counting ballots so tricky? Or why do some people want to make it seem like it's so tricky and so open to a lack of precision or durability?
Well, that is another great question. And again, as a political scientist, it's one that fascinates me. One thing I'll say, put it in the perspective of my talk. When we say our democracy all democracy is predicated on counting votes, and votes usually now get expressed in ballots, either in written ballots or machine ballots. So what are those election clerks actually doing when they're tabulating ballots? Well, each ballot, first of all, they're making a decision. Is this a valid ballot? And behind that is the question, was this person or is every person eligible to vote? So the final number that they get of votes that's the number of people that they decided, or somebody decided, were eligible to vote and came in and cast a ballot, and the ballot was considered valid because it had the right signatures, let's say it was a mail ballot or whatever. So that the number of votes or the vote tally that we get is not really a good measure, or it's a perfect measure of all voters' preferences. Only those voters who were deemed eligible and countable by the ballot clerks. So that's one reason why they're hard to count. The other reason, well, you read the news as much as I do. In this, I don't think there's ever been a time when someone has so deeply challenged the validity of our voting as Trump has done. And that is really unsettling for a system that depends on voting and people's faith that their vote makes a difference, and that the votes are honest. So, and it's also deeply unsettling how apparently easy it has been for one person to undermine faith in elections.
Frighteningly easy, apparently. When in fact there are some things about which we're in South Florida, so if you remember the land that brought you the hanging chads.
Yes. Yeah.
You wouldn't want someone to mishear your talk and say, see, all that counting is as I want it to be, and all I have to do is pressure a couple of election supervisors to flip, and I get to be president, for instance. Not that would happen in the United States of America, you understand, but if hypothetically.
Thank you for bringing that up, because I want to make clear that some people have worried, especially when I was first starting to write the book and I was shopping around the proposal. People worried that I would be feeding into the anti-science mentality, and don't trust experts, don't trust numbers, don't trust. And that's not at all my message. I think that a gullible faith in numbers can be as dangerous to effective policymaking as dismissing science out of hand or dismissing numbers out of hand. So what I hope I'm doing is helping people ask good questions about how to get behind the numbers, inside the numbers, to find out where they come from, what they really mean, and what else we might be counting or asking about to get more valid measures.
Super. I think we've synthesized and addressed in one way or another Here's one we passed over, but it's related to the question of race, and I thought we moved on from that. But should we consider racial classification as a temporary measure with the final objective of not counting by race at all? It's an ambiguity there, but perhaps you get the first.
Can you, where is the question? Is the question up there in the chat, or are you?
Yeah, no, it's in the Q&A. Yeah, it's the nth one from the bottom. Should we consider racial classification as a temporary measure? In other words, a means to an end, so that we can throw it out after we've managed to eliminate racism in the world?
I think that's what a lot of people hope, and even promise. But I'm not an optimist that we're going to eliminate racism in my lifetime. Again, I think we should consider all numbers and measures contingent and subject to constant improvement. That's what we should be aiming for. If we, I don't know, it's a good question. As France, as some of you probably know, the French government does not count race in its statistics, because it feels that doing that is inflammatory in a society that has racial problems. So, but whether not counting something is just putting your head in the sand, I'm not sure about that. I think we talked about this earlier with your question, Ken, that I think to do something about disparities among different populations, you need to be able to measure them and find out that they exist. So for now, we have to keep doing it.
Seems to me that as things go, that's a really good summation for your presentation today. I think there are no other burning questions. I was just reminded by your talk of how every year at budget time in academia, we make arguments to chairs and deans and provosts using the following argument: not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. With that, perhaps I will pass the baton to Alberto and Michael to draw us to a close. Or I will.
Thank you again, Deborah. I mean, I think that it was a very good talk that I think summarizes the main points of your book, which I would encourage people to take a look at if they have the opportunity. Precisely because I agree with you that what it does, and I think that your talk did the same thing, is not to dismiss counting outright. What you do is to sort of like try to tell people, you know, numbers are essential, counting is essential, defining things is essential, but all these definitions and the counting associated with these definitions and demarcations is the product of human beings applying and creating these boundaries between objects. And, you know, human beings are not robots, right? We are not Vulcans from Star Trek, right? and there are always biases, there are always problems, there are always limitations, and it's extremely important as to become informed citizens, not only to use data, but to become a little bit more, I would not say nihilistic about them, but a little bit more, you know, have a wary eye, a little bit more skeptical about them, still use them, but always take into account all the biases and uncertainties that are always related to data, particularly when it relates to human beings or human phenomena, right? So I would like to thank you again for being here with us today.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I look forward to listening in on your other talks in the series. Thanks again. Thanks everybody for coming.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.